So officially welcome to the California Policy Forum's webinar on narrative essentials, effective storytelling, and issue messaging for stronger advocacy. We're joined with a really special panel today. Before we jump into content, I'm just going to get us started on a little bit of housekeeping to enter us into this program. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I'm sure we're all pretty used to Zoom by now, but just as a refresher, you're able to view closed captioning by clicking that closed caption button on your screen. We're utilizing a Q&A chat box today, as well as the conversational chat box that you're all introducing yourselves through. So when you have questions for speakers, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box or in the chat box. And we're going to have people monitoring those tools throughout so we can make sure that the questions get to the speakers. Feel free to have conversation in the chat box with your peers, although we obviously want you to be paying attention to the wonderful presentations that are going on as well. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a chat message to our event tech in the chat box and they'll help you get that figured out. And then this webinar is being recorded, so the recording and resources will be emailed to registrants in a few days. Next slide. So a brief view of our agenda for today. We're going to look at a 360-degree view of narrative change, some guidance on the essentials to really set the context for our conversation. Then we're going to talk about messaging to advance your narrative externally, coming up with a game plan. And then we're going to have a case study from the Women's Foundation of California all about narrative and culture change. It's a really exciting program. And with that, I will pass it along to Jeanette Brown from Cal Nonprofits to get us started and introduce us to our speakers. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Well, I'm Jeanette, Policy Director at Cal Nonprofits, and I'm happy to kick off this session. So our goal today is to better understand the essentials of building an effective narrative, as well as a game plan for advancing that narrative externally. It serves all of our missions if we know how to improve the understanding of solutions by the right audience. Therefore, we need to ensure nonprofits and the philanthropy community are equipped with the know-how to build narrative power both internally and externally. And our first speaker is Marisol Bello, the Executive Director of the Housing Narrative Lab, which is a national leader in conducting narrative research and providing tools and training. And then we're going to move to Holly Minch, the founder of the Lightbox Collaborative, which aims to help nonprofits, philanthropies, and other do-gooders do better by developing brand strategies, messaging, and media. And then lastly, Bia Vallera, CEO of the Women's Foundation California, is going to go into a great case study for us about the Culture Change Fund. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, which is Marisol Bello.
Perhaps we could get video access as well. It looks like I can't turn my video on. But maybe we don't need it. Can you all see? Nope. Yep. Can you all see the screen?
We can. Yeah.
Super. Wonderful. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Marisol Bello, and I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Narrative Lab. And I'm here to, super excited to be here with all of you to talk about the thing I love most, which is narrative change, and the power of narrative to change how we think about things. Housing Narrative Lab, it builds support for housing solutions that create strong, vibrant, and healthy communities. All of us on this call know that housing is foundational to building the kind of communities where everyone has what they need to thrive, right? And so the Housing Narrative Lab conducts narrative research, and we help folks implement narrative so that we can make the kind of narrative change that we need to reimagine housing as a basic need that we absolutely need to have public investment for. We do that in 4 ways: research, training and education, coalition and collaboration, because you will see as we go through the conversation, you cannot have narrative change without coalition and collaboration building. And lastly, implementation support, and that looks like messaging, content creation, storytelling, etc., all the things that are connected to that strategic communications piece. So first things first, what do you all hear when you hear the word narrative? Maybe add it in the chat. When you hear the word narrative, what comes up for all of you? Let's see some words in the chat. Story. Yeah. Storytelling. Storyline. Power. Oh, I love that. Power. Yes. Right, building power. Narrative is mental models, persuading. I love it. So narrative is one of those words that you ask 3 people, you get 7 answers. It's like a line from my favorite movie, Princess Bride, which is, you keep using that word, I don't think it means what you think it means. And narrative just kind of conveys so much depending on how we are thinking about the word, the kind of work that we are doing. It really has a lot of meanings for all of us. So that's really exciting. Thank you all for sharing a series of stories. I love it. All right. So hang on 1 second. Let me just get to the. All right. So at the lab, when we think about narrative, we think about the big story. That is the collection of stories that shape how we think and feel and act about an issue, or how we think about the world. We are all, not just the 70 something of us on this call, but every single person is influenced by narratives, the narratives that we see on our computers and in our phones, the narratives on what we read, what we watch on TV, the narratives when we are at church and we are sitting next to someone who's telling us an idea, or telling us about an idea, or anything that's happened in the world, right? So we are influenced by narratives because we see them, we see stories in politics, policy, news media, pop culture, you name the thing, the cookout, right? Narratives shape everything around how we view the world. So it becomes really important for us to understand what narratives are, how they are formed, and how they influence how we see the world and how we think about the world. And the first thing I will say is that narratives form in an ecosystem, right? So we're going to talk about the ecosystem in a moment, but it's really important to note that we all play a role in that ecosystem, both in being a passive recipient and a passive passenger, if you will, right? Watching the ecosystem, as well as being able to connect and be a part of that ecosystem and advance the narratives in the ecosystem, which I'll talk about in a moment. Thinking broadly about narratives, they really permeate in 3 ways. If there's something that you're going to walk out of here with, is thinking about narrative and narrative change happening in 3 ways: scale, consistency, and repetition. That is to say, everyone, everywhere, all the time, right? So when we have this ecosystem, we can seed our narrative in this ecosystem through scale, consistency, and repetition. All of us, everywhere, all the time, really seeding a transformational narrative or transformational narratives. We each have a role in this. And when these narratives, when these stories are out there in the world through everything that we have around us and all of the media and our conversations with people, they permeate, right? This collection of connected stories, they permeate until they become just a part of the lexicon, right? And then stories become part of our everyday lives. We share them, we hear them, they become just part of the ideas and perceptions until eventually they become part of the public attitude. So it's just very broadly thinking about narratives, and I'm going to dig into that ecosystem in a moment. So someone on the chat mentioned that narratives are about power. So Fumi Mtetwa, and I apologize for mispronouncing her name, their name. They're a South African feminist and social justice advocate. And they say that narratives are about invisible power, how perceptions, belief systems, and ideology shape the way people define what is right and what is wrong. So I want you to think about strong narratives that have persevered during both our lifetimes and just always, right? So thinking about the narrative of David and Goliath, right? The little person versus the giant. thinking about narratives of the founding fathers of the United States, men who have been equated with the ideals of freedom and liberation that are foundational to this nation. And yet, those men owned people. They enslaved people. So thinking about the enduring power of narratives. This is why it matters. Right? It matters because people act based on their feelings and their beliefs. It matters in all of our work because based on those feelings and beliefs, people will support solutions based on what they believe the problem is. Right? So for much of the work that we are doing, if people understand that broken systems, for example, the work that I do is connected so much to housing and homelessness. So if people understand that broken systems are why people don't have a home, or they may feel housing or may be experiencing housing insecurity, the solutions that we bring forth make sense to them, right? However, if folks believe generally that if you don't have a home or you don't have what you need because you are lazy, think about the narrative of the welfare queen, for example, the harmful narrative of the welfare queen. If folks believe that you're lazy, you've made bad choices, then when we, in all of our work, offer solutions that provide resources for people, that doesn't make sense to them. So they're thinking, you want to provide someone housing when they've made a bad choice. There's a disconnect there for the public. So it's important when we are thinking about our narratives, understanding where people are coming from so that we can start to figure out how are we talking to them? How are we helping them understand or frame this issue in a way that makes sense that they can then support what we're talking about or support our particular solutions. Right now, right, we do a lot of this, right? We are telling our stories in ways that are not connected. We are using social media, for example, as a bullhorn, a one-way bullhorn for our talking points, and it's often very hit or miss, right? So we talk about a story here, a solution there. We're not really telling cohesive, unified stories, everyone, everywhere, all the time. So it kind of feels often like the equivalent of a flower growing in concrete. But when we think about a narrative ecosystem, we want to think about this. What does it look like to create a vibrant ecosystem, an interconnected ecosystem? This is why it's so important for us to understand that ecosystem and understand how we can all play a role in creating an ecosystem where we are all advancing a shared narrative or shared narratives about how people thrive. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the narrative ecosystem as we see it. At the lab, we think of the narrative ecosystem starting with community values, right? Looking at what is important to our community. And that community may be those 80 of us on the call. The community may be our varying audiences that we are trying to reach and connect and move to action. So those audiences are going to shift and move. But it's really about what is it that our communities, the folks that we are trying to reach, whether they're part of our base or part of a group of people we're trying to persuade, what do they value? What do they care about? And then at the lab, we conduct research to really think about what are the attitudes, what are the values, what do these groups of people hold dear so that we can figure out how best to talk to them based on where they're at. Because it's not that we want to reach them and leave them where they are. We want to get them to listen to us and then move them. But often how we talk with them is going to make the really big difference. So we really kind of are digging into what our audiences and our communities value. Excuse me. And then we conduct narrative research to really think about how to reach them. And we really what helps us then, once we have that research, it really helps us to figure out framing. And that is to say, thinking about how are we talking to folks, right? How are we presenting those values that are going to shape how our audience receives the information. And framing is really about what we emphasize, how we explain, what we leave unsaid. Are we focused on telling the story of a policy? That's framing. Are we focused on telling the story of a person? That's framing, right? These choices and how we kind of approach the conversations and approach the stories, they matter because they affect how people hear us, they affect how people understand us, and how they act ultimately, because that is what we're trying to do, is move people to action. So there is a science to framing, and it helps us to be heard and understood. The research helps us at first because it helps us understand, like, what are the messages, what are the ways to reach these people, and it helps us figure out the framing for how to get into it. So when we think again, so now we've got this ecosystem, we start with community values and research, then we start to think about the framing. How are we really kind of getting at having those conversations with folks? Excuse me. Once we figure that out, then we get more into the nitty gritty of, like, what do the stories look like? What is the messaging and the strategic ways that we are communicating to them? Excuse me for one. Apologies. Stories are how we communicate. We've got really strong framing, thinking about the approach. Then we have to start thinking about, what are the stories that we are going to use and tell. Stories are so critical because it's how we build trust, connection, and empathy, help people kind of understand our world. The messaging is the words, the images, the sounds that we use to tell those stories that advance the narratives. And lastly, the strategic communication is the act of communicating those messages. As you can see in our ecosystem, narrative does not equal framing, does not equal messaging, does not equal strategic communications, does not equal storytelling. They are all connected and they're all dependent on each other, but they don't equal the same things. So the ecosystem helps you kind of see the ways that they'll come in. Once we think about all of these elements, excuse me, I'm having a little bit of a coughing fit right now. Then we're thinking about how we seed these stories and these words and messages and visuals into the world. And the strategic comms helps us to decide how we do that. And the way it goes out into the world is through our policies and campaigns. Pop culture, we don't do enough in this space. How are we seeing this on TV? How are we seeing this in social media? And then media, which is journalism, right? TV news, magazines, news articles, such a powerful way. So this is kind of that mass media way that our messages can get out into the world. When we do all of these pieces and when we connect all of these pieces of our ecosystem, we have the big story, the collection of stories that shape how we think, how we feel, how we act. We talked about this a little earlier. And when those collection of stories come together over time through scale, consistency, and repetition, here is the impact. You change public mindsets, you change public discussion, and ultimately you change social norms. I want you to think about smoking, for example, as a really good example of how all those pieces came together in the ecosystem to shift how we went from seeing smoking on TV and everyone was smoking to look cool, all the way to now, right, where it is considered a social justice issue that is impacting so many of our Black and Brown communities. I want to say we all have a role in narrative change. It happens in surround sound. It's not just for one particular set of people, your comms folks or your content creators. It is everyone, everywhere, all the time. Narrative has to happen in 360 in order for people to see and hear us consistently and repetitively. So whether you are in advocacy work, you do any of the pieces that any of the 80 or so of us on this call are involved in, whether you are government or business, whether you are in mass culture, journalists, social media, etc. All of us, everywhere, all the time, we all have a role because each of you talk about your work. And so how you talk about your work is that piece of that you can have a piece of the ecosystem. It doesn't mean that you have to do all the pieces of the ecosystem, but you have a role in that ecosystem. Lastly, in my last few minutes, I want to give you an example of when the ecosystem is firing on all cylinders. This is what it looks like. Many of you are familiar with the Grants Pass case that occurred and that was heard before the Supreme Court earlier this year. And in advance of that, the Housing Narrative Lab partnered with the National Homelessness Law Center to dig into attitudes and values that people hold about housing, really looking at how people think about housing as a commodity versus a public investment, how they think about homelessness and housing insecurity, and who and why people experience homelessness. And most importantly, really looking at this case and the arresting, finding, and jailing of people because they have nowhere to go as a solution to housing insecurity and homelessness. And the results of that research, remember I said we were looking at community values and research, really kind of led then to this blooming ecosystem of how we all of us that are working on this issue were able to communicate together about this particular issue. So this comes from our partners at the National Homelessness Law Center, and they did a series of graphics, right? And these were straight from the research. 2 in 3 Americans have a personal connection to housing instability. Either they or they know someone who has experienced housing instability. Right? 61% of Americans agree that unaffordable housing is the major contributor to rising homelessness. I want to say this is a really big shift because we did similar research 3 years ago and we found that 49% of people considered systemic problems like the unaffordable cost of housing as a factor in rising homelessness. The majority, by a small margin, but the majority thought it had to do more with personal choice. The fact that now that has shifted really points to how more people are feeling the housing crunch. And then almost 3 out of 4 Americans agree that arresting, fining, and ticketing people for sleeping outside will not solve homelessness. So first, here's a series of graphics that just straight up talked about and showed you the results of what is some pretty critical research. But we didn't stop there. Right? We had a series of rallies. We did a big rally in front of the Supreme Court when the case was heard in front of the Supreme Court. And we had speeches and signs. There were emails to supporters. There was data and stories, news stories. And we amplified each other's message. And the messages were key. They were the messages that you saw in the previous series of graphics that went up in digital media, which is that arresting, fining, and ticketing people is not the solution to homelessness, and that in fact, it will make things worse. That housing is what solves homelessness. And you can see in all of these photos and in these news stories that central narrative, arresting, fining, and ticketing people who have nowhere to go, will make homelessness worse. Housing is the solution to homelessness. That came across in all of the work that many national, state, and local partners conducted leading up to that Grants Pass case and in the aftermath of the Grants Pass case. So you're seeing, again, this was from Community Solutions. No matter our race, or income, we all need a safe place to sleep, because that was a central narrative as well. I'm going to just share a couple of other ways that you will see how, when I talk about scale, consistency, and repetition, this was a really key example.
People are making laws to fine, ticket, and arrest people for sleeping outside. What do you think about that?
That would make
basically me, a house mom who doesn't really get in trouble for anything, a criminal. Due to my unfortunate circumstances, you're going to make me a criminal and you're going to give me tickets that I know I have no money to pay, and therefore there'll be a warrant out for my arrest, which would eventually lead to jail time. They're not addressing the true issue. And we've got a serious problem all across the United States, not just here in Boise. And that's not helping the situation. It's actually hindering. People are making
You can
laws.
see. Oh, all right. Let's go to the next one here.
Can the government ban people from sleeping outdoors, even if there's no other shelters available? That's the question
I'm going to pause that one for time. I actually want to get to this other piece. That video was a Washington Post story that, again, talked about arresting, jailing, and fining people was going to make homelessness worse. Really central narratives that came across through all of these stories that we were engaging in.
What?
So this one was, I love to include this one because this actually came from Into Action, one of our partners that we brought in to do a series of memes that then we could share on social media. And so this was one of them, right? When you have to explain why you shouldn't ticket or arrest people without homes for sleeping outside. You will, if you go to the Jiffy Library, you will see it. Here's another one with John Oliver, Finland, Fixing Homelessness. Says, let's address the root causes of this issue. America, fixing homelessness, prison, right? And again, so you can see in all of these examples how there's one narrative and it's showing up in so many ways. Excuse me. How it's showing up in so many ways. This is what it looks like. This is narrative change in action. So I'm going to stop here, but I want to leave you with two questions. I want you to be thinking about, what does home mean to you? Number one. And secondly, do we tell the stories of what home means to all of us? Are we telling stories in that way? So as I pause, I'm going to share our email and the message guide that the content you saw was based on, where you can see very specific messages and other examples of putting those messages into action. And with that, I'll turn it over to Holly, I think is next.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Marisol, so much. That was an amazing presentation. I especially love that that incredible graphic with the narrative ecosystem. And I'm going to jump right in and do a little bit of have a little bit of conversation about that third ring on that narrative ecosystem graphic where we're talking about strategic communications and messaging. So I'm going to pick right up where Marisol was laying it down. And talk a little bit about how we take these big ideas of narrative and really move them into action into the world. I see we have a raised hand, so I want to make sure that one, people can hear me, and two, people can see my screen.
Holly, we just see the screen on your computer, not the slides.
Oh, well, that's not awesome. Let's fix that. Thank you very much for letting me know. Let's see. I think I shared the wrong thing, so my apologies. And hopefully that fixes it. Yay! Excellent. Thank you so much for the flag. Thanks for letting me know. So what I want to talk a little bit about today, again, is taking these big ideas about narrative and really giving you some tools and some resources to help you move those big stories into action and put them to work for your organizations. Because each of you, right, we're all do-gooders here on this call. We all have a vision for a better world, right? We all have this big idea that we want to bring people along to our yellow brick road. But unfortunately, folks are a little distracted, right? We live in an attention deficit economy. And because there's so much vying for our attention, there's so much competition and noise and clutter out there in the world, we've got to figure out how to break through, right? Getting a moment of someone's attention is gold. And in some cases, it will cost you more than gold to get that attention for any period of time, right? So we've got to really be thoughtful about how we break through that noise and that clutter in order to advance our narratives, right? We're talking with folks who have a lot going on. A lot of considerations on their mind, and we need to figure out how to be relevant. We need to figure out how to, as Marisol said, frame our stories and position our narratives so that they make this busy man's life easier, more connected, more meaningful. I want to quote one of our dear friends, a brilliant narrative strategist, Anat Shenker-Osorio, and she will often say, in a nod to Jay-Z, that people have 99 problems and our pitch ain't one. So our first thing to remember is that often we as nonprofit communicators make the mistake of starting with a problem, right? Like, have I got a problem for you? Let's all solve a problem together. And people feel like they have a lot of problems already. Thank you very much. And so part of what we need to do is figure out how to package our narratives and position our stories and frame our messages so that they are relevant and so that they are addressing the problems as people see them, right? That they're tapping into those narratives that connect with the worldview that folks have in order to, again, make this guy's life more relevant, connected, meaningful, easier. We can do that with our messages if we tap the narratives the right way and we think about how to connect with people in the right ways. And in order to do that as nonprofit leaders and coming from the sector where we often have fewer resources than we do good ideas, we need to focus those resources. And coming up with a really smart strategic communications plan actually gives you some tools to focus those resources. It gives you ways to prioritize so that you're freeing up capacity. It allows you, when you think smart and plan smart around communications and really thoughtfully plan how you want to advance those narratives, it allows you to say a more meaningful yes, because you're really clear what you're trying to do and you're really clear what you're saying no to, what you're not trying to take on. And so I want to give you some tools, right? We want to give you a way to make a game plan for your organization. And some people might think of game as an acronym, but I would humbly submit that it is a helpful mnemonic device. And these are the 4 components of a game plan for your organization, right? A strategic communications plan to help you advance your narrative. And I think we're going to drop some things in the chat. Matthew maybe already has, so thank you very much for that. What we want to do is give you this free tool so that you can follow along and create your own strategic communications game plan. And a game plan includes 4 components: really clear goals, a clear understanding of your audience, a sharp message, and some means to engage your audience in conversation around that message. So it's these 4 elements that I'm going to speak to and kind of run you through in the next few minutes. Again, you've got that tool if you want to follow along. It'll take you to a spreadsheet, a template you can use to craft a communications game plan for your organization to advance your narrative and bring those big stories to life in the world for your organization. Let's talk about the first component of goals, right? So the first ingredient in a smart strategic communications plan to advance your narrative are sharp goals. And I want to give to you, by way of example, the Vision Zero Network. And what I love about this organization is that their goal is in their name. And this chart breaks down what they're trying to do, right? What they're trying to do is essentially change a narrative from a traditional approach to traffic deaths. And to be clear, Vision Zero, their network is to eliminate all traffic fatalities and injuries and to increase safe, healthy, and equitable mobility for everybody, right? So their goal is in their name. And they see a flaw in the traditional approaches, the current narrative, if you will, around how we think about traffic deaths and injuries in this country. And then they're showing you how they want to shift to a new vision, a new narrative around traffic deaths being preventable, right? It's not an accident, it's a crash, for example. Even the language we use is part of what they're trying to shift in this vision towards zero traffic deaths. So I just love that their goal is in their name, right? The narrative shift that they're doing is already right in their name. Then, in order to craft a smart strategic communications plan to move your narrative, you have to have a clear understanding of your audience. And I want you to take a look at this piece of communication. And I want you in the chat to do some analysis of this piece of communication. So the organization behind this, by the way, is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, really generally putting out some sexy stuff. But I want you to in the chat drop, who do you think is the target audience for this ad? And what understanding of that audience does this ad display? What narrative is it tapping into? What narrative is it shifting or changing, challenging maybe? What's going on? What's the narrative happening in this ad? Who's it for? Target audience is parents. Yep, parents, and specifically moms. I will let you know that the folks behind this ad, they were specifically trying to speak to moms. And knowing that, right? So yeah, the story is around keeping kids safe, but what else is going on with these kids? right? What else is happening with these kids? They're safely buckled into their car seats, which is great. But what else is going on? What's the other story we're interacting with here? What's the other thing that's happening for parents that's going on in this ad? I'm looking to the chat. Right. Thank you, Zoe. You've got it, right? Parents are overworked. They're stressed. They don't have time to worry about another thing, right? And we're just living life, right? Thank you, Jacques. I think that's exactly correct, right? The idea that like parents have a lot going on, right? And frankly, what they're trying to say here is you don't have to be a perfect parent to get some things really right? You don't have to be a perfect parent. It doesn't matter if the kids are messy, if they've got ice cream, if they've got, this, I love the little girl has a very devious look on her face, right? Trouble is a brewing, and that's okay. You can still do right by your kids if everything isn't perfect. Just keep them safe, right? And so the story we're playing into, right, of really understanding the worldview and the life experience of busy moms, busy parents who are overworked, stressed out, juggling too many things, right? We're acknowledging we understand you, audience. We understand what's going on for you. We understand your worldview. We understand the life you're living. And we want to be with you in that story. We want to be with you in that experience you're having and still get a message across to you, right? And still be relevant and have a conversation with you that you're going to understand and that shows empathy for you. I think that's another really important component about how we tap into narrative. If we approach our audiences with empathy and an understanding of their experience and their worldview, we have a better shot at crafting a message that's going to be relevant to them. And so that's the thing I really want to underscore. You cannot message effectively if you don't understand your audience, right? You have to understand what narratives are alive for them. What competing interests are they juggling, right? What are the things that we need to understand about our audiences in order to really connect with them? And that sometimes will involve segmentation, right? Drop an emoji if you've ever segmented an email list. Put an emoji in the chat, right? If you've ever had to segment your email list, you had to think small about your audiences. So thinking small about our audience is actually a really great trick when it comes to crafting effective communication strategies and connecting with our audiences. Because if you can think small, you can start to understand what's going on for this particular subset of my audience, just like this ad reflects that understanding and that empathy for what's happening for parents. If you think small, you can start to really listen and understand your audiences. And I will say you cannot craft effective messages like this one without doing some listening, without really tapping into what's going on for your audiences. And the punchline here is that if you're thinking about your audience as the general public, you're not going to be able to tap into those subsets, those worldviews. You have to think smaller in order to really effectively connect with your audiences, right? You need to really get inside the heads. If you're trying to talk to everyone all at once, and I agree with Marisol, right? We do have to have smart, echoed, connected narratives everywhere all at once from all of us, but we might segment the messaging that we're using for particular audiences. So it's this idea that narrative permeates, and the way we do that is with targeted, focused messaging. So I want to, I've sort of said all this, so I'm going to skip to message in the interest of time. And I want to think about or define message is this idea of like, what are we saying people to motivate them toward action on our goal, right? What are we saying that reflects our big story, but says it in a focused and targeted way? And so I want to give you a tool for messaging that I absolutely adore from our colleagues at Opportunity Agenda. And what I love about this message model, thanks Matthew for dropping that in the chat. What I love about this message model is that it's clearly drawing from the big story. It's drawing from narrative, right? It's laying claim to values that are drawn from narrative. It's providing a lens through which to view and define a problem through the narrative. And it's positing solutions through that worldview. So it's taking your narrative and distilling it down into a tight message. And it also has a call to action that's going to be situational, right? Your narrative, there's a big worldview you're trying to shift, but your specific call to action in the moment will change based on your audience, based on the moment of opportunity, maybe a particular campaign you're in, but it always ladders up to that long-term change you're trying to create. So great tool from the Opportunity Agenda. And here is an example of this tool in action. And this is from an organization called the Statewide Revenue Alliance. So again, sexy, sexy stuff. And they were partnered with a great organization called We Make the Future. And We Make the Future has amazing research, narrative shift tools, tested messaging that's available for free on their website. So if you're looking for resources to help you craft messaging of your own, We Make the Future is a fantastic resource. Check them out. But what I love about this example is that it clearly is informed by a big worldview, a big narrative, and distills it down into a very tight message, right? This is 4 sentences from a big narrative worldview around raising revenue in our states to really make sure that our communities have what we need, distilling that to 4 sentences. And even better, I'm going to show you a quick clip that distills this message into a video.
We create more than enough for everyone, unless someone refuses to contribute and wants to take it all for themselves. Corporations take the wealth our work creates and refuse to do their part for the things we all rely on. So it's time we call our reps and demand that corporations pay what they owe. Letting corporations hoard it all? That's nuts.
So quick example of how you can take this message and do something clever, if the cost effective, and fun, right? Taking a very serious message and making it something fun that people will want to consume online and share with their friends, right? Who knew that talking about corporate revenue and state taxes was going to be cute? Thank you, Liana. This idea that we can take a very serious message and package it in a way that people will want, again, that notion of being relevant, connected, easier. We can say something very serious in a way that lands with people, that reflects our worldview, connects with their experience, and makes them want to tune in and listen. So quickly, I want to talk about the 4th component of our game plan, right? This tool that moves our narrative out into the world. And that 4th component is engagement. We have to engage our audiences in conversation around our message toward our goal, right? And so there are a whole host of ways where you can get your message out. And I share this graphic with you not to overwhelm, right? Think of this whole list of possible tactics not as a mandate, but as a menu, right? There's a huge array of ways that we can get our message out to the world, right? So owned media really is a way, that's what we own, right? Our website, our platforms that we control, we publish, is the way that we sort of seed our narratives, right? That's where we establish and begin the conversation around our narratives. And then when it comes to shared media, right, we're starting to distribute those narratives in broader and broader platforms. We might use paid media to even expand the reach that we're using to distribute our narratives. And when it comes to earned media, that's actually where we get we establish credibility, right? We get an outside seal of approval, right? As Marisol was saying on that 4th and final ring in the narrative ecosystem, when other people start to echo it, affirm it, reflect it back to us through media, journalism, pop culture, that's how we know we're starting to get sticky, right? That's how we know we're starting to get some credibility and acceptance of our narratives. So this resource comes from, it's actually called the PESO model, paid, earned, shared, and owned, being the acronym there. But this comes from Jeannie Dietrich at a great organization called Spin Sucks. And there's a link to this tool in the chat to help you think about all the possible ways that you can engage your audiences in conversation toward your narrative. And again, the idea here is not that you should do it all. That way lies madness and exhaustion. The idea here is that you can use a really great, smart strategic communications plan as a tool for discernment to help you determine which of these many tools for engagement might we use. And the other thing I want to just flag as I close down here is this idea that oftentimes our organizations begin the conversation at the end. We begin the conversation with, oh, what tactics should we use to engage our conversation? Let's write a press release. Let's get on TikTok. Drop an emoji if that's ever happened to you. If someone's come to you with like a tactic or a tool and you don't necessarily have all the components of strategy in place to know whether or not that's going to be an effective tool. What I want to say is you can use the game plan in reverse, right? So I shared it in Drive, goals, audience, message, engagement, but you can work it in reverse. If somebody gives you, hey, we should be on TikTok, hey, we should do this particular tactic or tool, ask them those questions in reverse. That's a great tool for engagement. What message will we carry to what target audience and to what end? Right? You can use this tool to work to reverse engineer strategy when you find yourself in a conversation about tactics and how do we move our narrative. You can use these tools to help you develop an effective communication strategy to backwards walk so that you know you're using your resources most effectively, you're focusing your time and energy, and you're going to be much more confident that you're going to be able to carry that narrative toward your goal to your audiences. So I know we are running a little bit over on time. I'm going to stop there and we'll share my contact info. If anybody has follow-up questions, I would love to talk with you more about how you can move your narratives out into the world and how some of these tools can help you. And we've dropped some tools on earned media in particular. I know there were some questions among this group coming in today. So there's some tools for that in the chat, and here's where you can find me. I am here for it, and I am super excited to hear from Bia at the California Women's Foundation about how they've done this and putting it in action.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everybody. Bienvenidos todos. I'm so excited to be here. So I'm Bia Vieira, she, ella, her, with the Women's Foundation California. And I want to talk to you about the Culture Change Fund. Hold on, I'm trying to follow the, okay. Thanks. I am going to talk to you about the Culture Change Fund. As you know, we are a foundation, we are a public foundation that has been in California since 1979 and have spent a lot of our work really looking at systems change, and have a 21-year-old policy institute, have really changed a lot of policies in California and really worked to change who is making policy and who is speaking in Sacramento. And part of what happened after 2016, after the elections of 2016, we and a number of other funders throughout the state, but also nationally, were thinking, okay, how are we going to think about issues of gender? Because there were a number of attacks on gender that came from the administration, the Republican administration. So we came together and formed the Culture Change Fund. And that is a collaborative fund. There were 11 donors, 11 funders thinking about gender justice and reproductive justice in particular. So I want to say that there is a way in which the speakers today talked about the messaging and engagement and all of that. And that is part of what we were looking at the Culture Change Fund. And we were also looking at kind of narrative power and culture change as an ongoing strategy that folks are using, had been using through the years, but didn't have the resources to really implement it as its own strategy as part of their goals. So I wanted to say that we started the fund in 2019. We wanted to raise $10 million in a fund for 5 years, which I have to say we have done. So we started the fund in 2019 with a research. And there is really wonderful research that's called Story at Scale that looked at some of the issues that you've heard of already today. We did a national study of, how do people think about gender justice in general, just to think, and reproductive justice. Then we also looked at what are the possible audience segmentations that organizations could use when thinking about the audiences they're trying to reach, not only audiences that they already have, but audiences they want to bring along with them. So if you go on the storyatscale.org website, you can see all of the research, all of the background on the research, all the tools are in there. So we looked at the research, we looked at audience segmentation. We developed 6 different kinds of audiences. We developed a story platform, story pillars. We did a lot of message testing to understand what worked with different audience segments. And the thing that was really interesting for us is that this is pre-COVID, so this is 2019, is that the story pillars, the things that came to us from focus groups, from workshops, and we did workshops in California, Georgia, and Michigan. And those 3 states, because 1, we are in California, 2, because Georgia and Michigan were states we identified that were going to be very important for the 2020 elections. So the things in terms of story pillars that came across for us is that stories really had to be joyful, pleasurable, and fun, abundant, not scarce, that there was a sense of safety in community, that we are different but equally valued, that messages that are life-sustaining, that really also looked at curiosity, kids, and the future, and wanted to have the story, the core, some of the pillars of the work was really that there's joy and abundance, we're free to love and be loved, that because there's difference, because difference is seen and safe when we all live within us, so life is equally valued and sustained. And I say these things to say that what was important to us is not, we understood that it wasn't a question of developing certain campaigns and messaging. It's a question of, that is a piece of it, but it's really a question about how movement building organizations are going to be able to use that information and have, again, an ecosystem of messages and experiences and stories that are leading us to a future where there's gender justice, gender racial justice in California, but also in the United States. So I'm going to say, tell you that we work very closely with a number of organizations, with a number of national organizations who in 2019 were really thinking about the 2020 elections. So we have some folks who worked with us in the field they're 4 pillar partners, anchor partners, sorry, Illuminate, Illuminative, Center for Cultural Power, Harness, and the League. And these are national organizations, but also that have very strong state presence. So part of why we were working with them is to be able to provide technical assistance to the fund, but also to working with communities on the ground as well. So one of our partners that did an amazing campaign and did an amazing kind of narrative change work was the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, who has been a partner with us for many, many years. And they, in 2022, were working on organizing and talking at Bell Gardens in Southeast LA. And as they went through a process of really listening to the community, listening to the folks they were talking to, they were not talking about they were not talking about reproductive justice. They were talking about housing, which makes sense given the previous presentation that we heard. And so really thinking about rental costs, rental increases, being evicted, and especially after COVID. So CLRJ came to us and said, we want to develop a campaign that really is looking at rental stabilization in Bell Gardens. And we want to do this using all of the tools from the Story at Scale, in addition to the fact that we know how to connect with people and we know how to organize. So CLRJ then worked made the connection between reproductive justice, health, and housing. They started to organize and talk to the community, the residents of Bell Garden, and spent a lot of time doing trainings, doing message training, doing connecting the the residents with other folks in the community, and also how to then make sure that they were able to then go to city council to get this rental stabilization ordinance passed, which they did pass, and it's really the first city, Southeast LA, majority Latina, that passed rent stabilization. And it was really through this process of, it's a combination of the strategy, the culture narrative change of a reproductive justice organization working and making the connection with a housing organization, but also really addressing issues that are so relevant in the community and at top of mind. And at the same time, staying connected community so that the conversation after rent stabilization also included so much more of the work that the organization was doing. And one of the things that's been really important for us in terms of the Culture Change Fund is that it's really creating this capacity for movement, building organizations to use these strategies more effectively. Because we do know that for systems change to happen, we do need to know the policy piece, we need the organizing piece, we need the mobilizing piece, but we also need the narrative and the culture change piece. And I'm happy to talk more specifically about the fund, but that's one example I would like to share with you in California. And who should I pass it to?
Thank you, Bea. I can take over. Well, thanks for the three wonderful speakers and really sharing, the different work that they do and kind of the connection between that and narrative work. So we can go ahead and start taking questions now. Yes, as the slide is saying. I haven't seen anything come up in the Q&A chat, but feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A function on Zoom for any questions. But in the meantime, I do have a question that kind of directly falls into Bea's points about the relationship between funders and communications works and narrative. Before that, Robert, do you want to spotlight Holly and Marisol as well? That way we just see all three of the speakers too. Or yeah, that works too. Great. So, I think we talked a lot about the content and strategic framework of how to do narrative work. And I really want to lean into Bea's piece about engaging funders. So I'm curious about, for Marisol and Holly, what has been helpful for you all in your relationship with funders? And are there any tips or examples on how funders should approach this kind of engagement with community-based organizations so that y'all can continue to do the work that you do in narrative change and in narrative in general?
I'll say we've observed funders really leaning into the notion, some of the ideas that Marisol talked about sort of building coalition and building your choir and creating the surround sound that is required for narratives to move. I think that's one of the places where we're seeing a lot of funders lean in, right? How can they align not just their own grantee partners, but also those organizations, networks, and extended ecosystems in order to bring folks together to align around narrative strategy and to build the skill and will among those coalitions and networks to really to get information, right? And to work together to advance shared narratives. So that's one of the places we've seen funders really lean in.
Absolutely, I would agree completely 100% with what Holly was saying. Also, a couple of things that I am noticing. One is very clearly a much broader and deeper understanding of the role of narrative in helping to shape solutions and how helping to shape how people think about the solutions that we're all working toward. And so not just with funders, but I think also more broadly in our varying movements, people are really understanding sort of the critical nature of narrative. And now where I am seeing in all of our spaces is more about how are we implementing it. So thinking about what is the infrastructure to the point of the coalition and collaboration building, right? Bia mentioned how you have this intersectional work being done with gender rights and women's justice and housing, right? That can, for some folks can be thinking of those as silos, but they are actually so interconnected. And so I am seeing more now around what does that infrastructure look like? How are we thinking of that infrastructure and then building it out so that we can start to implement the narrative change? And I think that's really important. And I'm seeing that show up in many different kinds of ways. So for example, I'm seeing several funds that are digging deep on doing training with all of their grantees to figure out how we all as grantees are moving toward a shared narrative, for example. So you're seeing a lot of that kind of work. And we're engaging in a lot of that kind of work that really is kind of helping people not be matchy-matchy or not all be in the same vehicle, but moving in similar directions, right? That we have a shared North Star. And I that's one of the big changes that I've been seeing, and really gratified to see that.
Yeah, I'm really hearing that from both you, Holly, and Marisol. Like it's this idea of, the philanthropic sector and funders really being able to pull together the folks that they fund and really make sure that we're on a united front, right? And that we're moving in a similar direction, as Marisol said. Bea, you unmuted?
What I wanted to say is that I think we're in a moment where there's interest in terms of the philanthropic interest, and I think it's still difficult for folks to access dollars just for this work, partly because this work takes a long time, and there aren't enough yet ways that on our end, on the funding, and have kind of agreed on what are good metrics. And I even hate to say this out loud, but it's not our how we are thinking about it, but it is how our colleagues are thinking about it. So there's a way that it's still a little, I think if it's a campaign and you're talking about messaging and, for example, the ballot measures and like across different states, and I think there's a way in which folks understand that, but really like narrative change that's tied to movement building and community, I think that's a little harder to get folks to really support that. But, we started this in 2019. There are a number of kind of donor collaboratives thinking about this, not that many, but some. And I think that there's an opportunity moving forward, but I still think it's still, there's a lot of learning that can still happen.
Yes, for sure. We have another question in the chat, or in the Q&A chat. It says, how do you recommend obtaining stories in a workplace where everyone is focused on providing a service, but perhaps aren't thinking about sharing stories they come across consistently? And they're asking this from the perspective of someone who does not offer direct services.
I can jump in on this. So two things are coming to mind. One is that everyone has a story to tell, right? So no matter who you are, no matter what role you have, everyone has a story to tell, especially in the spaces around providing a service. Having said that, it's super scary to think about telling our stories, or also thinking about having the families and individuals that we work with sharing stories, because we feel that it may feel transactional. And so a couple of things I would say to that is that we can work to make sure that those stories are not transactional, that we are not turning to people when we get a phone call from a journalist and say, hey, we need a person with 2.5 kids who is between the ages of 30 to 35 to talk to this journalist, right? That's transactional. But if we are training, coaching and mentoring people on how to be advocates and use their voices to be leaders, that's shifting how we then are thinking about storytelling. So one is really intentionally focusing on storytelling as a means to advocacy and leadership, particularly when it comes to people with lived experience of any kind, whether it's lived experience as a provider of the service or lived experience as someone who is receiving the service. That's the first thing. Second thing I will say, and this particularly applies, I think, to the service provider front, when folks think about stories as this sort of transactional piece, I think it's important to remind folks that there is a science behind storytelling. Our brains, in order for just like physiologically, like the science of how we receive information and how we are persuaded and how we take action on an issue, all those parts of our brains light up when we hear story, because story is essential to how we communicate as humans. And so I think that piece of reminding people this is actually based on evidence, this is based on science, because it is how we as humans perceive and understand information, I think is a really critical piece. And then it's on us to then make sure that we tell those stories and shape how we are telling those stories and who is telling those stories through an ethical lens, making sure that there's a lot of diversity in who is the storyteller and who they're talking to.
Plus 100 to everything Marisol just said. And in the interest of being like super practical and tools oriented, which is kind of how we operate, I'm dropping in the chat some resources we've aggregated to help organizations who are trying to crack this nut of figuring out how to aggregate stories and how to elevate the leadership of the folks you serve or the folks on your team, the advocates who are in your movements. So there's some tools there that I've dropped in the chat. And one of the things we did some work a number of years ago with, for example, just on the tip that Marisol is talking about in terms of being supportive and not extractive when it comes to how you engage around storytelling. We actually worked, there was an immigrant rights organization, and during the whole Dreamer movement where people were really being very bold about sharing their own immigration status and very forthright about their own stories, we actually worked with an organization to craft a storyteller's bill of rights, so that that organization and their network partners were really clear on how are we engaging people with those stories, how will those stories be used, what kind of control do people have about where their story is shared, all those kinds of considerations. And so if anybody has questions about that, I'm also happy to continue that conversation.
I would say for if you're thinking about like a way to like share and have stories with a lot of integrity, one of the very nice examples is one of our grant partners is We Testify. If you're thinking about reproductive justice, they also have a Bill of Rights. And how is it that because it's, people are putting sometimes their lives at risk by sharing their story.
Yeah, sharing our stories can be really vulnerable, and sometimes that's the thing that will move folks. Really love this piece about, sharing stories not just as a transaction and not extractive, but really as a way to change culture, to shift things, and to advocate. And I just really love that piece. Then we have time for one more quick question. This is from Alicia in the chat. When you mention narrative research, what does that entail? Do you research for each campaign or for each unique audience?
Maybe I'll just jump in first again here. So yeah, narrative research, the answer is yes to both of your examples. The narrative research is twofold, can serve several functions. First, it's really to gauge attitudes and values about a particular issue. The narrative research that we conduct is slightly different than the public opinion polling that you might see related to a campaign, for example, like vote yes on Prop A, right? And then you do a public opinion poll to see how folks are thinking about it, why they're going to vote yes, why they're going to vote no, what are the messages that are specifically connected to that. The research that we are doing is really looking at if that campaign, for example, is focused on housing, we want to really dig in to what people are thinking about housing. Are they thinking about housing as a commodity, as a public need, as a basic need, as an investment? If you have it, it's your fault or not your fault. Are they thinking what is the role of government in helping to provide housing? We're really digging in to what people's attitudes are around it, what solutions they think make sense. I'm using housing as the example because clearly that's a big part of the work that we are doing. And so the narrative research is there to really help you figure out these are our varying audiences. These people think this way, right? The base is thinking this, and this is how we can talk to the base to get them to move to a particular attitude, solution, etc. The folks in the middle, persuadables, are thinking this kind of way. How are we talking to them so we can persuade them? And then this is this is who makes up the opposition. And so we're not really going to focus so much on those folks. They're not invited to the cookout, but we don't want to get them so riled up with our messages that they're going to come out in full force. So what are the messages that get the base activated and moving and mobilized? May persuade the middle to kind of come to our side, and we'll just neutralize, right, the opposition so they don't come at us with all blazing. And so the research really helps you kind of start that conversation to really understand what the values are. Costs can vary. They will shift and move based on, your different budgets that people may have, what your actual outcome is that you're looking for in terms of the research. It may be connected to a campaign. It may be connected to broader narrative change that Bia mentioned, right? So those are all things to be thinking about.
And I'll chime in. I think there's a couple. So again, always plus 100 to everything Marisol just said. And I think there's also a way to think about this. Like I'm recognizing that some of the organizations in this room are like emergent in the way they're starting to engage around narrative. And so how do you, right? There's sort of narrative research with a capital R. And then I also think there's some bite-sized ways that organizations can begin with smaller listening, right? If you're not in a coalition that has assembled the resources to do deep narrative research, how can you begin doing some listening using free Google tools, right? Doing social listening on your platforms, doing simple surveys, right? Like there's sort of capital R research, and then there's like the putting your toe in the water where you can begin with some listening, which might not have the formality or the rigor of some of the kind of research that Marisol is talking about, which is so worthwhile. And I think there are things that you can do to begin to dip your toe in that water that will also be really informative for how you think about the work.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. Thank y'all so much. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Emily to close us off as we're nearing 11:15.
Thank you all for a really wonderful presentation. I know I learned a lot. I really loved how interactive you all made the chat. So thank you, audience, for participating. As we said earlier, the recording is going to be sent out along with the resources that were mentioned by our speakers and mentioned in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate having this really interesting, diverse audience of nonprofit and philanthropy participants. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that everyone has a story to tell, and we just need the right tools to be able to help tell them. So thank you all. Thank you, panel. Thank you, audience. And we will see you at the next California Policy Forum webinar.